So Janet, welcome to Nodes and Ways.
Thank you.
For anyone who doesn't know, Janet works with Crowd2Map, a program mapping rural Tanzania to help girls escape FGM, which is female genital mutilation, which is a big problem there. It's illegal, but still practiced, but using OpenStreetMap to help. So Janet, what brought you to OpenStreetMap?
Okay, well, I've always been very interested in technology. I used to be an IT teacher. Got a computer very, very early, learnt computer programming when it was on punch cards. That's how old I am. So when I started as a volunteer for Tanzania Development Trust, visiting projects there, I realised very quickly that the lack of maps was a huge issue. So I thought that this was a solvable problem. So we had a few false attempts trying to use various different programs. But then when I discovered more about OpenStreetMap and the wonderful community of people using it, then we've never looked back, really.
You know, a lot of map makers do have some kind of community element to them. I know like Here Maps has Here Map Maker, and Google has some suggestions that you can make to the map, but nothing really compares to what OpenStreetMap has as far as the community and the power that the community has to work on the map.
Absolutely. And they're really lovely people, very supportive.
So tell me more about why maps are needed and how maps help specifically.
Okay, well, on one of the first times I went to Tanzania, I was visiting a school. It was pouring with rain. The person that I was with didn't know where it was. We drove around for 2.5 hours looking for this school. We literally drove through rivers, through muddy rivers, and the school kept phoning us saying, "Where are you? Why are you so late?" And we drove around in circles because there was no maps, there was no road signs. Because it was raining, everybody was inside, so there was nobody to ask. And I live in London. I'm used to being able to put anywhere I'm going into a map and being routed there. It seemed very, very difficult in Tanzania. And when I started working with Roby Samweli, who's an FGM survivor and activist, she would tell me that she'd get a phone call in the middle of the night saying girls are going to be cut in Kabancha village. Well, Kabancha village was not on any map. There's no road signs. So it was very difficult for her to get to those girls quickly enough sometimes, particularly in the middle of the night. And I just thought people in rural Tanzania need maps, and it's not so hard to start making them. So in 2015, I started Crowd2Map, and we've been mapping ever since.
Oh, that's great. So when I heard the words female genital mutilation, I instantly freak out inside. I'm like, oh no, that sounds so horrible. But can you tell us what it is and why it happens and why we should be helping people get away from it specifically?
Sure. So FGM is the cutting of the female genitalia for religious or cultural reasons. There are different types. It can involve cutting the clitoris, and it can involve sewing the woman up as well. It leads to very widespread health complications, including in sometimes women, girls, bleeding to death. So Roby Samweli herself, her best friend, bled to death from this. And when Roby herself was cut, age 13, she lost so much blood that she lost consciousness for several hours and were great worries whether she would actually ever totally recover. So, and every year that there is a cutting season in Tanzania, generally coinciding with the long school holidays. And every year girls bleed to death and die. And in those cases, the culture says that they're cursed in some way and they're not allowed to be buried or even spoken of again. So their bodies are thrown into the bush to be eaten by wild animals generally. So it's a horrible issue. It comes about because girls and women are seen as property, really. So generally girls in Tanzania are cut as to make them ready for marriage. Cut girls are sold for more cows than uncut girls. So generally, when girls are married, their family, usually the father, will get cows as dowry from the husband. So that's a source of wealth. So it's because girls are seen as property. So
Hmm.
it's part of that whole patriarchal system.
Right, right. So the safe house that Ryobi is running, basically, you want to enable girls to get from where they're at to the safe house, correct?
Yes, and also to enable the police and social workers and the activists to quickly get to the
Mhm.
girls, which is more likely what happens.
Oh,
So
gotcha.
some girls do come by themselves, but the majority of them, because they generally come from very rural, remote villages, so they will generally try and get themselves to a place of safety within that village, which could
Hmm.
be with a teacher or with a pastor. Or now we've set up these digital champions who've been mapping their villages. They're all connected via a WhatsApp group, and they also look out for girls at risk and alert the authorities.
Hmm. You know, one thing that we had touched on before last time we spoke was that where you're at and where I'm at, there's maps. If OpenStreetMap didn't exist, we would still have plenty of maps. I wouldn't have a problem finding a map if I needed to find somewhere, but it just doesn't exist there at all. So if we're going to know where that safe house is or where the safe place in that village is, you have to put it on a map because it just doesn't exist today at all anywhere.
I mean, for example, Google Maps, you can have villages of 10,000 people, just doesn't exist. It's
Hmm.
if you look at it, it's just a white page, nothing. No roads, no buildings, no villages. You would never believe that there was thousands of people living there.
Yeah. Well, and it makes sense because if you're a commercial mapping entity, there's probably not money to be made there,
No,
and we're not necessarily a commercial map entity.
no.
Not that there's not companies making money off OpenStreetMap, but that's not
There are there
our
are
target.
there are indeed. I mean, and companies like Facebook, in particular, and Microsoft have helped with the mapping procedures. So, and they're also investing quite a lot into machine learning to improve the mapping process.
So what tools are you using to accomplish the mapping?
Okay, so we have around 13,500 online mappers, the majority of whom came from the UN online volunteering website.
Hmm.
So they're using the humanitarian OpenStreetMap tasking manager. So Crowd2Map is a member of what's called Missing Maps, which is basically like it sounds. It's organisations that are trying to map the places where maps are missing. So rather than waiting for disaster to strike, like a hurricane or an earthquake, and then realising, oh, we desperately need maps, we're trying to add places before that happens. So humanitarian OpenStreetMap tasking manager is a way that we can take a particular area where we want to map, and it divides it into a grid so that you can have many people mapping at the same time at more or less the same place without getting all mixed up with each other's mapping. It also means that you can have new mappers that map, and then a more experienced mapper validates their work. So that's
Right.
the main tool that we're using for online mapping. But then people in India, New York, London, wherever, can see the satellite images, they can see the roads, they can see the buildings, but they don't know what any of those buildings are. So we're also
Hmm.
training people on the ground in Tanzania to add local points of interest, such as churches, mosques, shops, clinics, schools, etc. And to do that, we're using two methods. Firstly, we're taking open government data about school and clinic and water point locations. But the main way is training people on the ground to use smartphones to use an app called Maps.me, which uses the phone GPS, and you can add places directly into OpenStreetMap, which has been brilliant. And we've also been training people like the police and the activists to use Maps.me for routing to particular places, which they love. They think it's like magic because it's the first time they've ever been able to do that. And it works totally offline, which is even better.
Yeah. As we were talking about before, the maps that just don't exist. So when you do map an area and show that to someone, that's the first time they've ever seen a map of where they live. And that must be an amazing thing.
Absolutely, yes. So, I mean, people love seeing it on a phone or a laptop, but even better, they really like to see a printed map of their village. So, where possible, when we've had funding to do so, printing off, a PDF or something of all the features has been a fantastic activity, and that's something that we did with the digital champions as part of a project called Women Connect.
Oh, what's that about?
So, Women Connect was a project funded by USAID that we were part of in 2019 with Humanitarian OpenStreetMap, and that allowed us to train the digital champions in 87 villages in Serengeti. So, it was a fantastic opportunity for us.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting. So, what's the training like for someone who's never seen a map of their area to teaching them to how to map their area?
Well, it had multiple challenges, particularly. So we went to these very remote villages with with people from Hope, which is the FGM organisation, and the local government, and we trained their women and children's protection committees about mapping and using. Generally, it was about using smartphones because very few of them had ever used a smartphone before. So, and then they chose one woman who would become the digital champion, and we left a phone with her. So a lot of the training was about technology, about actually this is this is a camera, this is how opening an app, etc. So it was quite basic training,
Right.
but then we did follow-up trainings mostly via WhatsApp, and also Roby and her team did manage to go back to the villages, and we did follow-up training where possible.
Well, I guess you have to start with the basics.
Absolutely, and you also have to do what you can afford to do.
Right. So, if I'm sitting here, and how could I help you?
Right. Well, if you would like to get involved in mapping, we have a number of projects on the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap Tasking Manager. If you look for Tanzania Development Trust, but also we have a very active Slack channel. So new mappers generally put their mapping in there, and they get feedback from experienced mappers. If you want to help with mapping, then that's the best way. And if people email me, then I'm happy to give them more instructions. Also, if you want to know more about our work, then on our website, Crowd2Map has some information about that as well.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned you do what you can afford. Is there a way that people can donate if they wanted to help out?
Absolutely. Yes, and the money goes a very, very long way. We're all volunteers. We have no running costs, so any money donated goes directly to projects, to our projects. Most likely for travel to get around to all the digital champions, or to pay for their data, or repair the phones, etc. We're using very, very cheap smartphones, cost about $30. So they don't last forever. Yes, there is a donate button on the Crowd2Map website, and any donations would be very gratefully received.
Oh, that's great. So another mapping question. Are there any other local mappers in Tanzania who are not related to this project that you're interacting with?
Yes, so I mean, we've set up youth mapper chapters in I think 7 different universities in Tanzania now. Youth Mappers is a global organisation for student-run mapping groups. There's also a very active mapping community in Dar es Salaam called Open Map for Development Tanzania. They'd done huge amounts of mapping around flood resilience and also about health boundaries and so on. So they've done fantastic work, and we've worked with them as much as possible. We organised an event for Open Data Day in March this year in Dar es Salaam.
That's great. So if I want to help, or if somebody listening wants to help map, and we go to your tasking manager and we pick out a square and we start mapping, can you give us any tips? What's the mapping like there? What's the terrain like?
Right. Well, it differs quite a lot depending on exactly where you are. So generally, though, most of the roads are not tarmac. Some of them are changed depending on the season, so they're dried up riverbeds. Many of the buildings, there are quite a few round buildings that are round huts, so you have
Oh,
to
okay.
look out for those. Yeah, some of
Okay.
the imagery can be a bit tricky.
Yeah. Yeah, I could speak to that. I picked out a square, and I was having some trouble knowing if things were roads or if they were dried up riverbeds. I was trying to figure out a lot. It was quite a challenge, but it was very interesting to map a completely different terrain.
Yes, and a very common mode of transport would be piki, which is a motorbike. So
Okay.
there will be a lot of tracks that are only accessible by motorbikes.
Right. So is there any particular mapping tags that we should use or something we can avoid? Any tips for actually doing that
Well, I
mapping?
mean, on the tasks, there is quite detailed guidance, including a link to the Africa Highway Tagging Guide. So,
Hmm.
and we do have a lot of videos. We even have some quizzes around road tagging on the Slack channel. So,
Well, that's great.
I would really, if you're interested in that sort of detail, then I would really urge you to join the Slack. It's has a lot of information on there, and it's an active community.
So obviously you're here to help with FGM. That's what this is all about. But can you tell us other ways that your mapping work is helping there in Tanzania?
Absolutely. I mean, we're not just mapping for FGM because FGM is an issue in certain areas of Tanzania, not others, but we're mapping in all of rural Tanzania,
Hmm.
even in the places where it's not an issue. But mapping is of a huge help for all aspects of community development. So when I visit district medical officers, generally they don't have a map of where the clinics are. Education officers don't have a map of where the schools are. So, even visiting them can be difficult. The schools, Tanzania Development Trust supports a number of different schools. Generally, students walk extremely long way to get to school, up to 2 hours in each direction, and that puts girls at particular risk of sexual assault and pregnancy, etc. So we've worked with some schools to map the villages where the students are coming from so that they can argue for the need to have a girls' hostel, and then that they can work out which of those girls are walking the furthest to prioritise them for access to the hostel. Also, if a village wants to demonstrate that they need more water points.
Hmm.
So a typical village that we've worked with has around 9,000 people. They had 9 water points. They wanted to put in some bids to work out that they needed more water points rather than
Hmm.
one per 1,000 people. And so having a map showing where the water points were, where the population centres are, is vital for planning where additional resources should go.
Yeah, that's great. So, and I imagine you get a lot of support with Tanzania Development Fund for all those different efforts as well, right?
Yeah,
So it sounds like you're working with a lot of different groups between the United Nations, Tanzania Development Fund, HOT. I've heard youth mappers. How many organizations are you working with?
I don't know. It's hard to say. I mean, we work with anybody who has overlapping interests.
Oh,
So we've
great.
done corporate mapathons. I did a corporate mapathon with an organization, American organization, yesterday. We've worked with lawyer groups in London, many different organizations.
So do you have any examples, or can you point to anything specifically how mapping has helped somebody facing FGM?
Well, so are many times when girls or a neighbour in the village has said there are girls going to be cut tonight,
Hmm.
and that has and they've specified where they are, which has allowed the police and Roby to get there quickly. That happens very often. The organisation I mentioned in Dar es Salaam, their country manager had a very bad road accident 18 months ago, and their car rolled over, and he desperately needed to get to the nearest clinic, and so he looked on OpenStreetMap and he found that the nearest clinic was one that Crowd2Map had actually added as to it, and he went there and he managed to get treated and airlifted out, etc. So I sent a message to the mapper who'd added that clinic about just how useful and potentially life-saving the fact that he'd added that clinic was. So,
You know, I like everything about what you're doing, but I think my favorite thing about what you're doing is that OpenStreetMap a lot of times is thought of as an academic exercise or a hobbyist exercise, and it is those things as well. But you can see how powerful and life-saving it can be. And we always hear OpenStreetMap is the map that saves lives. We heard that with the Haitian earthquake mapping a couple of years ago. But it's neat to talk to somebody who's doing it on an ongoing basis. This is humanitarian mapping, but not after an earthquake or not after a typhoon or a hurricane. This is an ongoing day to day, just the way it is, saving lives. And that's an amazing use of OpenStreetMap. It's really great.
thank you. Yes.
Janet, thank you so much for coming on Nodes and Ways. I really appreciate your time and you coming here. For anybody listening, I will link in the show notes Crowd2Map Tanzania and their tasking manager, so you can take a look at that. And again, Janet, thank you and happy mapping.
Thank you. Happy mapping, everyone.